happy to welcome you back once again as we are continuing our studies of New Testament Greek. You've made it to chapter 20, and if you get through this chapter and really have a good feel for the material that we have in chapters 18, 19, and 20, all of which, as you know, treat participles, then this is just a bit of a doorway into really understanding the fundamental structure of the Greek language and the syntax of the Greek language. Everything that we've done so far has really been preliminary, but at this point, if you get a feel for how the Greek language uses participles, then that may be the single most important insight into understanding the structure of the language. Now, of course, there's always more to learn. You have to learn vocabulary, etc. All of these other things are going to be part of your studies. There's other grammar that's going to be a part of the important matters that you need to master, but really this is probably the most distinctive feature of it. And so I've spent a little more time on these lessons, just hopefully to give you an opportunity to really get some sense of familiarity with how these basic uses of the participle inform the application of the Greek language. Chapter 20, as you may be aware by now, is dealing with the aorist passive participle. We've looked at the present participle, we've looked at the present passive participle, and now we're looking at the aorist passive participle. And of course, at this point, we are talking about action that precedes the time frame represented by the leading verb, but also represents passive action. One of the illustrations that Machen uses in this chapter, for example, might be, you might say that Jesus, as he was casting out the demons, spoke to his disciples. Well, if we had that, we'd have a present participle. Jesus, as he was speaking, or while he was speaking, cast out the demons, you see. Well, in that case, we'd have a present participle. Jesus, while casting out the demons, was speaking to his disciples, that idea. If it were in the passive voice, we would have the demons being cast out by the Lord, you see. So then the focus is on action that is taking place to the demons, things that are being done to them, the passive voice. If we use the aorist passive, then we're going to be shifting the entire time frame to a setting that precedes the leading verbs. So you might say in a similar sentence, the demons having been cast out by the Lord then spoke to the disciples, that sort of thing, where you have some kind of action that is preceding the time of the leading verb and also represents, of course, passive action, the passive voice. I think you'll understand the basic grammar. The main challenge here is simply to once again master the endings that are associated with the passive voice in the aorist participle. We're going to find that basically this involves a change once again to the stem. You may recall that when we looked at the aorist passive verb in the indicative mood, we also had a change in the stem. We can talk about balo, I cast. We could talk about abalon, using the second aorist there, in which I would say I cast the ball. But if I go to the aorist passive, then the stem itself changes to the word blaze, so it becomes eblathane. You see, I was cast. And you've, of course, picked up on that. Well, when we're in the aorist passive participle, again, we have that same aorist passive stem that's being used. So we're going to see our friend eblathane coming back once again, that particular stem being used in the aorist passive participle and others that are like it. So again, it'll be somewhat familiar territory, but once again, you're going to have a new set of endings that are associated with the aorist passive participles. Not totally new. You will recognize some similarity to endings that you've already studied, but again, this is going to be a little bit of new terrain as you seek to master that. The other feature that is added now in this chapter is, again, one of the most important and one that you want to make very sure that you understand. The exercises will give you plenty of opportunity to work this out, and hopefully by the time you're done with them, you'll have a pretty good feel for how this works. But it's called the genitive absolute. The genitive absolute. It's explained by Machen, and he gives an adequate description of it, so I'm just adding here a little bit of a further comment. The genitive absolute makes use of the participle. It can be the present participle, It can be the aorist participle, it can be active voice or passive voice, doesn't matter. And so he's simply introducing it in this chapter because he wants to incorporate it in his discussion of participles. But it's not distinctively connected to the aorist passive participle. Essentially, what it is establishing is an idea that you can have an independent participle clause within a sentence which is separated really as absolute. That is, it's its own independent phrase that doesn't necessarily directly connect to either the subject or the verb of the main sentence. If I can give you an example, it would be something like this. I could say, the Lord speaks to his disciples. You see, so there's a sentence. Now, if I were to say, the Lord, having cast out the demons, speaks to his disciples, then I would have a simple participle in which action is being referred to the subject of the sentence, namely the Lord. The Lord, while casting out the demons, is speaking to his disciples. But if I were to say this, as the Lord was casting out the demons, the apostle was speaking to the men, then you see we have two separate clauses. I have the Lord casting out the demons, and then separately I have the apostle speaking to the men. Well, in that case, we can't tie the participle either to the subject of the sentence or to the men, which is the direct object in the sentence. We can't really tie it either way. It's an independent or absolute phrase. The Lord casting out the demons is a phrase which is not directly connected to the rest of the sentence, but is still in the sentence, you see. And so the way that the Greek language does that is by means of what's called a genitive absolute. And the reason it's called genitive absolute is because both the Lord and the disciple are in the genitive case. And that little distinctive arrangement is really something somewhat unique to Greek. You find something like that in Latin. Latin has what's called the ablative absolute, and so other languages use this, but it's certainly not quite anything that we have in English, and so you'll just have to get a feel for this, and I think the exercises will give you plenty of opportunity to do that. All right, well, enough said. Let's go ahead and take a look at the vocabulary list and some of the paradigms that are provided to you. I'll look at some of the examples as well, and then we'll, as we usually do, look at the first three of each of the exercises that are set before us by Machen here. All right, so let's take a look at these vocabulary words. Once again, we have a little bit that is new, but also we have here some that are simply new forms of words we've already learned. For example, you know the word grapho, I write. Graphes, you'll notice here, could actually, if we simply had the word itself without the accent, be understood to be the second person singular in the present. You recognize that, graphes. Machen might put thou writest, you know, using Old King James, you write. But notice here, we distinguish between graphes as you write and this particular form, which has the accent on the ultima. That would be the way you distinguish the two. And if you find this form, then you know that what you're dealing with is what is sometimes called the second aorist passive participle. It's called second aorist because there is no theta in it, and normally the aorist participle, the aorist passive participle, has a theta. The absence of the theta here makes it a second aorist. The endings are the same. So we're going to see these endings as we go along. Just make a note of it here. The rough translation of this would be, in any given sentence, having been written. Having been written. The book having been written, the letter having been written, something like that. Again, you'll notice the accent is irregular in that it is on the ultima, so the recessive rule does not apply. Rather, the retentive rule applies to the participle, and we're going to find that the accent will stay on that syllable throughout the paradigm. This next word is simply the word eke. This word is an adverb. It never comes in any other form than what you see right here, and it simply means there. The next word we have is eutheos and euthus. These are synonymous. There's no difference that I'm aware of in the meaning between the two words. It simply means immediately. It is also an adverb, and so you'll never find it in any other form. It may be of interest to you to know that this particular word is used more in the Gospel of Mark than in the rest of the New Testament put together. This word shows up very, very frequently in the Gospel of Mark, and it sort of points to the picture of Jesus that we find in that Gospel as a man of action. It is interesting as you read the Gospel of Mark, even in English, you'll notice how frequently it is said that Jesus did this immediately or did that immediately. The word shows up virtually multiple times on every page of the Gospel of Mark, and it is this word, so you'll notice this quite a bit if you ever read the Gospel of Mark in Greek, which I certainly hope you do. Hemation is a neuter noun. It means garment or clothing. I don't know of any English word that comes from that root, and so that's just one to memorize. Oikeia is a feminine noun, which is basically synonymous to the word we've already learned, the word oikos, which means house. Oikeia is simply the feminine form of the same word. The two words are used quite commonly in the New Testament, and again, there doesn't seem to be any distinction between the meaning. It just happens to be stylistic in any given context, whether you find the one or the other, so just be aware of that. In this set of exercises, Machen will tend to use this word just to get you familiar with it, so as you're doing those exercises, you may make a note of that as well. Paidion is a word that means child. It is neuter. We already have the word teknon, which means child. Paidion means child as in a young child or even an infant. And so the difference between these two is going to simply be that paidion tends to emphasize the youthfulness of the child, whereas teknon can refer to an adult child. I might say that I am the child of my father, even though I'm in my 60s, you see. I still am a child of my father in some sense, but I wouldn't say I was a paidion. I wouldn't say I was a child in terms of a young child. That would be reserved to one who is of young years. So this word is used frequently in the New Testament. Both are used, and sometimes they're both translated by the English word child. That's where it helps to be able to read Greek, because you can see whether the youthfulness of the object is being emphasized or simply the fact that it's a child relationship. Synagoge. Synagoge is the word for synagogue, and of course the similarity between the English word and the Greek word should make that easy for you to remember and to master. It actually is rooted in the verb that we've already learned, synago, which means to gather together. So literally, a synagoge is a place of gathering together, a synagogue, a place in which the congregation unites in some sort of collective or corporate expression of worship. Stratiotes is a word that means soldier. Notice this is now the third noun that we've had that uses these first declension endings that are somewhat different from the rest of the first declension. We've had mathetes, we've had prophetes, and now we have stratiotes. They are declined the same way. The omicron upsilon here is tipping you off that it's going to follow the same declension as you would find with the words we've already learned. The accent is on the penult, and that's where it wants to stay throughout the paradigm, except, of course, where Rule 51 dictates that there will be a circumflex on the ultima. And finally, we have phulake, which means a prison or a guard. A prison or a guard. I don't know why they have the same word for both of those. They are not exactly the same meaning. They're related topics, I suppose, but phulake is referring to one of the two of those, and in the New Testament, normally it's pretty easy to distinguish by the context which meaning is in mind. Well, let's take a look here at the paradigm that we have in this chapter for the participle, which is based on luo once again. So the declension is going to be set forth here. Notice the main thing to detect is, first of all, throughout the aorist passive, we once again have the theta. We already noticed the aorist passive uses the theta in the indicative mood. Here we find similarly in the aorist passive participle the theta shows up, and this is what becomes the distinctive appearance of the stem in the aorist passive participle. So we're going to see that. That, by the way, is the reason that graphes, which did not use the theta, was called a second aorist, because it's an exception to the rule that typically would apply. So that's the first thing to notice. The second thing to notice here, of course, is that the accent shows up on the ultima and stays essentially on that syllable throughout the declension. So luthes, luthentos, luthenti, luthenta stays right there on that particular syllable. Similarly here, luthesa, we have of course a short ultima, and a long accented penult must have the circumflex. So luthesa, lutheses, luthese, lutheson. That's the first declension, or the feminine form of this declension. And then finally we have luthen, luthentos, luthenti, luthen, which is the neuter. When we come to the plural, again, these are fairly similar, and you should notice the similarity to what you've already learned. Luthentes, luthenton, luthesi, and luthentos. In the feminine side, luthesi, lutheson, luthesis, luthesos. And finally in the neuter, luthenta, luthenton, luthesi, luthenta. So you should notice that the endings are similar to what you've learned, but again we have them on the aorist passive stem. These are going to be somewhat similar to the material that you've mastered, so hopefully memorizing these won't be too much of a challenge for you. In the chapter, Machen gives you some examples which are indicated for purposes of getting a feel for how the aorist passive participle works. So let's take a look at the first of these. They're explained by Machen. I'm just kind of adding a little bit of my own explanation to it as well. But we have here ek blethenta ta daimonia, hupo tu kyriou, apeilthen ace tain thalason. So what do we make of this? Well, we notice first of all ek blethenta. I recognize blay is the aorist passive stem associated with balo. The ek adds the idea of casting out, so the aorist passive is going to be having been cast out. I know that the action is preceding the time of the leading verb. I haven't figured out yet where the leading verb is going to be taking place in time, but anyway, I have enough to go on to have some idea that it's going to be preceding that. So having been cast out, I see the thenta here ending is associated presumably with the neuter, and in this case it could be the neuter nominative plural or the neuter accusative plural. Could be either one, or for that matter it could be the masculine accusative singular. So right now I don't know for sure which one is involved, but I'm going to be able to determine from the rest of the sentence which way we'll go with our application of that aorist passive participle. Well, here I get my next information, ta daimonia. This is evidently going to be the subject of the sentence, and so I have ta daimonia, the demons, having been cast out, you see, aorist passive participle, hupa tu kyriou, by the Lord. But then notice here I have apeilthen. Apeilthen is the word from aperkamai, go away, and I have a little bit of a kind of a confusion here because I notice that it says apeilthen, that's the singular, third person singular, he, apeilthen, went away into the sea. Well, I'm looking for a singular here, and all I have is ta daimonia, which is plural, and then I, of course, remember that a neuter plural subject can take a singular verb, and that evidently is what's going on in this sentence. And so the demons, having been cast out by the Lord, went away into the sea. We don't know the word for swine yet, do we? That's probably an allusion to the parable in which Jesus sends the swine into the sea, having been possessed of those demons, but we'll have to leave a little simpler Greek for our usage at this point. But do you see how that works? So one more time, just to put it all together. The demons, having been cast out by the Lord, went away into the sea. Our next sentence, this is the example number 2. Egerthinti ek nekron proseilthon auto. Egerthinti. Well, notice here that we are dealing with the verb egero, which means I raise up. This is the aorist passive stem, egerthinti. This is not an augment, of course, because the original verb has the epsilon to begin, so egero, egerthinti. We have here the masculine dative singular, so I know that somewhere in this sentence I'm going to have a masculine dative singular word, and of course, lo and behold, there it is, auto. And so, having been raised up, ek nekron, of course, from the dead, proseilthon could be I went or they went. This ending could go either way. Typically, the context will make it clear. To him. So, having been raised up from the dead, they went to him. Now, I'm going to have to clarify in my English translation that it's him who was raised up from the dead. So I'd probably render it something like, after he had been raised up from the dead, they went to him, you see. So the translation needs to be clear so you don't leave an ambiguity as to who it was that had been raised up from the dead. Our third sentence, third example provided by Machen, hoi didacthintes hupo tu apostolou, eilthon eiston oikon. So once again, I'm going to notice that I have an aorist passive, but I notice it's in the attributive position. So it's the having been taught ones, the having been taught ones, and I notice that this is the nominative, masculine, plural, the having been taught, hupo tu apostolou, by the apostle, the having been taught by the apostle ones, and then that is the subject of the sentence, went, eilthon, eiston, oikon, into the house. Those who had been taught by the apostle went into the house. All right, well, the next set of examples provided by Machen illustrate the genitive absolute. So let's take a look at these. First, we have aponton, tauta ton apostolon, hoi mathetai apelthon. So, aponton, this is the second aorist participle, not passive now. You'll notice second aorist participle. It therefore has the present participle ending, but the second aorist stem, and so it's going to be something like having said. Having said. Now that's all I know so far, but I do notice it's in the genitive here, and so I'm at least suspicious that I may be dealing with a genitive absolute. We'll let the rest of the sentence confirm that point. Having said, tauta, these things, and then ton, once again in the genitive, apostolon, now I know for sure I'm dealing with the genitive absolute because I have the genitive ending here and the genitive ending here, and I have a participle that's involved, and so all of that tells me that this is a genitive absolute, and it's going to be rendered something like this. The apostle having said these things. So notice that the apostle, even though in the genitive case, nevertheless functions as the subject of this genitive absolute phrase. So the apostle, having said these things, hoi mathetai, the disciples, apelthon, went away. So you see how that genitive absolute works. We've got kind of a separate phrase right here, stands by itself. That's why it's called absolute, because it isn't dissolving, as it were, into the rest of the sentence. The apostles, having said these things, the disciples went away. Genitive absolute, good illustration of it. Let's take a look at the next one. We see legontos autou tauta hoi mathetai epelthon. I'm first of all noticing that I have the present stem. Lego was one of our first vocabulary words. I say. Here is the masculine genitive singular ending in the participle legontos. While saying is the way we would render that. I'm not quite sure what to do with this autou when I first see it, because I want to translate that something like of him or his. And then, of course, I remember, oh, this is a genitive that goes with that genitive, and hence I'm dealing with the genitive absolute. So I'm going to render it using autou as the subject of the genitive absolute phrase, and it's going to be while he was saying tauta, these things, hoi mathetai, the disciples, apelthon, went away. Again, you can see the genitive absolute phrase is right here. While he was saying these things, then the separate sentence, the disciples went away. And our third example, ton matheton, didacthenton, hupo tu kyriou, exelthon eis tein erimon hoi douloi. Well, once again, I notice that I have a genitive right here, ton matheton. I'm suspicious immediately. This is going to be a genitive absolute. My suspicions are confirmed when I notice I have a genitive, plural, masculine, ending on the aorist passive participle stem. And so, the disciples, having been taught, hupo tu kyriou, by the Lord, you see, and so there's my genitive absolute phrase. The disciples, having been taught by the Lord, then the subject of exalthon, I'm tempted to make it the disciples, but it can't be that because, of course, it's a genitive absolute, so I need a subject from elsewhere. Lo and behold, I see my nominative subject here is in the very last position in the sentence, but that doesn't matter. Word order is fluid. And so the slaves, exalthon, from exerchomai, went out. The slaves went out, eis tein erimon, into the desert. So the disciples, having been taught by the Lord, the slaves or servants went out into the desert. All right, well, hopefully that's pretty clear. Let's go ahead and take a look at the exercises. We have the first exercise, which is poruthentos to archontos, pros ton kyrion, hoi douloi, epon tauta tois mathetais. Well, first of all, I notice poruthentos. This is a deponent verb, so it's going to have this passive form. I notice that it has the genitive ending. This is the masculine genitive, singular, so poruthentos. And of course, seeing that genitive makes me think immediately, this is probably going to be a genitive absolute. My suspicions are confirmed when I see in the genitive case, to archontos, the ruler. So let's render this, the ruler having gone, then pros ton kyrion, to the Lord. So that is my genitive absolute phrase. Then hoi douloi, the slaves, epon, said tauta, these things, tois mathetais, to the disciples. So the ruler, having gone to the Lord, the slaves said these things to the disciples. The second exercise, poruthes pros autus, ho archon, epistusen eis ton kyrion. So again, I have poruthes, same word as I had here, but I notice that this is not now the genitive, but actually the nominative, singular masculine, poruthes. But it's going to be rendered, of course, as an aorist participle. It's not passive because it's deponent. So, having gone, pros autus, to them, ho archon, the ruler, and of course, because this is a masculine nominative, singular, it's going to be associated to that participle. So I could put after the ruler, had gone to them, and then epistusen, third person singular, he believed aston kurion in the Lord. After the ruler had gone to them, he believed in the Lord. And our third exercise, pistusanton humon aston kurion, euthus epistuse kai hoarkon. Well, I look here and I see pistusanton, that is a aorist active participle, and it's in the genitive, so I'm assuming we're going to have a genitive absolute going on here, but not necessarily. We'll see what happens. So, having believed, but then I see humon, and of course that is the personal pronoun of the second person, plural, and it is in the genitive, and so obviously what we're going to have here is you having believed aston kurion in the Lord, and that is my genitive absolute phrase. You having believed in the Lord, immediately, euthus epistuse, he believed kai also ho arkon, the ruler. So after you had believed in the Lord, immediately the ruler also believed. All right, I hope that makes sense. That's the translation exercises. Let's take a look at some of the composition exercises. The first one Machen gives us on page 126, if you're using the same book I am here. When the soldiers had taken the garments from the children, the disciples were cast out of the house. So when the soldiers had taken the garments from the children, I have to think more like a Greek, so I'm going to do the soldiers having taken the garments from the children. I notice, of course, that that is going to be a genitive absolute, so everything goes in the genitive, starting with tone, stratio, the soldiers, labanton, this is a second aorist participle. It's not passive now, it's active. So the soldiers having taken ta himatia, the garments or clothing, apo ton paidion, from the children. This is also in the genitive, but in this case it's because it's going with the preposition apo that takes the genitive. So the actual genitive absolute involves this participle and this genitive noun, which is in the genitive plural. The soldiers having taken the garments from the children, and then the principal sentence begins here, hoi mathetai, the disciples, exablethesan, were cast out, third person plural, aorist passive verb here, and the were cast out, ektes oikios, of the house. Notice I'm using the feminine form of this word because that's the new form that we've been given in this vocabulary, so I'll do that just to help us be familiar with that usage. So, when the soldiers had taken the garments from the children, the disciples were cast out of the house. The second exercise from Machen. When the disciples had been cast out of the synagogue, they came to us. First thing I notice here is this is not a genitive absolute. When the disciples had been cast out of the synagogue, they, that is the disciples, came to us. So I'm just going to use the normal participle function here. We'll say this, hoi mathetai, the disciples, ekblethintes, having been cast out. This is, of course, the nominative, plural, masculine, going with disciples. The disciples, having been cast out, ektes synagoges, of the synagogue, and then proseilthon, they came to, humen, us, in the dative, because proseilthon takes the dative. You could have used, of course, eilthon, pros hemas, and that would be they came to us. We'd get rid of the pros here and include it as a preposition over here. Either way is fine. So one way or the other, whichever way you did it, would be okay. But the basic thing you're being exercised on here is really this phrase, and recognizing that in this case it is not a genitive absolute because the disciples are actually the subject of the principal verb in the sentence. All right, in the last of the exercises here, it reads, while we were coming into our house, the Lord said these things to the rulers. Well, as I read that, I notice, of course, that I have a genitive absolute. While we were coming into our house is a separate phrase. The subject of this sentence is actually the word Lord. The Lord said these things to the rulers. So I know that this independent phrase is going to be in the genitive case. I also notice the word while tells me it's taking place at the time of the leading verb, so it's going to be a present participle. Coming is the word erkomai. Coming in is eis erkomai, so I have eis, erk, and then I'm going to use the present middle or passive ending, which is in the participle omenon, so eis erkomenon, genitive of course, while we, the word we is going to be present to indicate it's a genitive absolute. It looks like the of us kind of personal pronoun, but because it's functioning as the subject of this participle, we'll translate it we. So while we were coming eis tenoikian into the house hemon of us, this now is simply the possessive pronoun, not to be confused with that hemon, which is the subject of the participle. So while we were coming into our house, ho Kyrios, the Lord, epa, third person singular, the Lord said, tauta, these things, tois, arkusin, to the rulers. So there you have some applications of the aorist passive participle. I'm just going to warn you that as you begin working through these exercises, you've probably already detected it. You're going to sense you're kind of wading into the deep end of the pool here a little bit. You can have participles within participles, and all of that can become, at least initially, a little bit confusing. But I urge you, I plead with you to just hang in there, keep working through. Once again, do an exercise, look at the answer key. If it makes sense, great. If it doesn't, go back and redo it. Keep playing with it until you kind of see how this works. This is a key. And if you will master it at this point, don't rush through it, but if you'll really get a feel for it, then you're going to find the rest of what we do in Machen is simply going to be adding some important new information. I don't want to minimize the challenge involved there, but this is really the critical point. Machen himself, you might have noticed, in chapter 18 indicated that this is quite the critical matter when it comes to understanding the Greek language, and so I certainly urge you to take your time, digest it, get a feel for it, and that will reward you well as you continue your studies. It's been great having you along. I hope everything's going well in your life. I hope you'll be able to continue these studies, and as soon as you really feel pretty confident with the application of these participles, then let's get together again, and we'll move on to chapter 21. Until then, God's richest blessings on you and your studies, and we'll see you next time.